December 28th, 2008, 9:00 p.m. The last store went dark. A manager turned the key, the lock clicked, and just like that, 571 stores, 47 states, 50 years of American home life, gone. Not in a market crash, not overnight, in 8 weeks. Here's what that looked like at its peak. Towels stacked floor to ceiling in every color imaginable. Walls of cookware, aisles that seemed to go on forever. $2.8 billion in annual sales. The second largest home goods retailer in the United States. Every weekend, millions of American families walk through those doors like it was a ritual, because it was. Then a single boardroom deal changed everything. Not Amazon, not the recession. A $1.3 billion leveraged buyout in 2006 strapped $650 million in debt onto a company that was already bleeding. 2 years later, it was over. How does a 50-year empire collapse in 8 weeks? How does $2.8 billion become zero, while the people who engineered the deal walked away clean? Clifton, New Jersey, 1958 to 2008. This is what happens when Wall Street buys Main Street. Nobody predicted an empire. In November 1958, a man named Eugene Calkin opened a small leased linen department inside a discount retailer called Great Eastern Mills in New Jersey. No grand vision, no investor backing, no blueprint for world domination. Just a quiet belief that ordinary American families deserve quality home goods at a price they could actually afford. It wasn't glamorous. Calkin wasn't selling luxury. He was selling fitted sheets and bath towels to working-class people who wanted their homes to feel like something. Even on a tight budget, the idea was simple enough that it almost seemed too simple. And for years, it worked exactly that way. Small, steady, unglamorous. Then the 1960s rolled through, and American consumer culture began shifting. Suburbs were expanding. Families were moving into new houses and filling them with new things. Discount retail was becoming a legitimate industry, not just a stopgap for people who couldn't afford department stores. Calkin's little linen department was sitting in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. By August 1970, the concept had outgrown its corner inside Great Eastern Mills. Calkin opened the first standalone linens in Things store in East Brunswick, New Jersey. A dedicated space, just for home goods, just for the stuff that made a house feel lived in. Towels, bedding, kitchenware, the things people touched every single day. In an era when home goods retail barely existed as its own category, Linens and Things was essentially inventing the model. But the road wasn't smooth. In 1975, the parent company, Dahlen Incorn, filed for bankruptcy. For most people inside that organization, it was a death sentence. Assets frozen, stores shuttered, futures uncertain. But Calkin did something that would define the entire DNA of the company he was building. He didn't walk away. He reached into the wreckage, bought 7 store locations out of bankruptcy court, and founded an independent parent company from scratch. 7 stores, that's what he had. 7 stores and a philosophy. That philosophy was straightforward. Everyday low prices, not promotional gimmicks, not flash sales that train customers to wait for discounts, just honest pricing every day on merchandise that was worth buying. It was the kind of retail thinking that respected the customer, assumed they were smart enough to recognize real value without being manipulated into it. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, that philosophy quietly built something durable. Linens and Things wasn't flashy, it didn't chase trends, it just kept opening stores, keeping prices fair, and filling shelves with the things American households actually needed. The growth was steady rather than spectacular. The kind of growth that doesn't make headlines but builds real foundations. What Calkin had created, without necessarily intending to, was a retail institution. Not just a chain of stores, but a place that occupied a specific and trusted position in the lives of its customers. The kind of place people returned to not because of advertising, but because it had never let them down. That trust would take decades to build. It would take one signature to destroy. The 1980s changed everything. Not just for Linens and Things, for America itself. The suburban expansion that had been quietly building through the previous decade now accelerated into something unprecedented. Developers were bulldozing farmland from coast to coast, putting up strip malls and power centers as fast as concrete could dry. Young families were buying their first homes in subdivisions that hadn't existed 5 years earlier. And every single one of those families needed the same thing: stuff to fill the house, bed sheets, towels, cookware, curtains, the unglamorous, essential inventory of domestic life. Linens and Things was ready. Through the 1980s, the chain expanded with the confidence of a company that had found its moment. New stores opened across the Northeast, then pushed south and west, following the suburban sprawl like a well-calibrated compass. The format was simple, and it worked. Enormous floor plans, wide aisles, merchandise stacked high, prices held low. No frills, no pretension. Just a warehouse-sized store full of things people needed, priced so that buying them didn't require a second thought. The shopping experience itself became part of the ritual. Walk in on a Saturday morning, cartwheels squeaking across linoleum, the smell of scented candles from aisle 7 drifting toward the towel section, walls of cookware catching the fluorescent light, pastel bath sets stacked in towers that seemed engineered to be touched, unfolded, examined. Families moved through the aisles with the unhurried ease of people who knew exactly where they were and felt comfortable being there. This was not accidental. The store layout, the product selection, the pricing structure, all of it was designed around one insight that Calkin had understood from the very beginning. The American homeowner doesn't want to feel like they're shopping. They want to feel like they're choosing. Give people space, give them options, give them fair prices, and they'll come back every single time. By the early 1990s, Linens and Things had grown into a regional powerhouse. The IPO came in 1996, sending the company onto the New York Stock Exchange and giving it access to the capital it needed to accelerate. Wall Street noticed. Analysts liked what they saw: consistent revenue, loyal customer base, a proven format that scaled cleanly. The stock performed, the expansion continued, new markets, new states, new stores opening at a pace that reflected genuine momentum rather than reckless ambition. At its peak, the numbers told a story of an institution at full force. 571 stores spread across 47 U.S. states and 6 Canadian provinces. 300 employees, $2.8 billion in annual revenue. The second largest specialty retailer of home furnishings and accessories in the entire United States. In the world of big box retail, that was not a footnote. That was a throne. And yet, there was another company growing in parallel. One that shared the same category, the same customer, the same suburban real estate strategy, but was executing with a sharper edge. Bed Bath & Beyond. Founded in New Jersey in 1971, just 1 year after Linens and Things opened its first standalone store, Bed Bath & Beyond had been a quiet competitor for years. But through the 1990s, it began to pull ahead in ways that were subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The stores were better lit. The merchandise was more thoughtfully arranged. The assortment ran deeper on the brands that customers actually wanted. Where Linens and Things felt like a warehouse, reliable, familiar, slightly overwhelming, Bed Bath & Beyond felt curated, like someone had thought carefully about where you'd want to find the Le Creuset versus the Cuisinart. It was a small distinction, but in retail, small distinctions compound over time. Linens and Things responded the way large retailers often respond to competitive pressure, with promotions, clearance events, blowout sales, coupons and circulars and weekend deals designed to drive traffic and move inventory. It worked in the short term. Traffic stayed up. Revenue held, but the strategy carried a hidden cost that wouldn't show up on the balance sheet for years. Every time Linens and Things ran a sale, it was training its customers to wait for one. The loyal shopper who had once walked in on a Tuesday because she needed new dish towels and trusted the everyday price, she was learning a new behavior. Wait for the coupon. Wait for the weekend event. Don't pay full price because full price isn't coming. The brand was quietly redefining itself in the customer's mind. shifting from a place of honest value to a place you visited on discount. This was a slow erosion, invisible in quarterly earnings, dangerous in the long run. But the late 1990s and early 2000s papered over the cracks. The housing market was surging. Every new homeowner was a new linens and things customer. The category was growing fast enough that even a company losing ground to its primary competitor could post solid numbers and keep analysts satisfied. The stores kept opening, the revenue kept climbing, the stock kept moving. From the outside, the empire looked unshakable. Inside, the foundation was already shifting. Not dramatically, not in any way that triggered alarms, but shifting nonetheless. Comparable store sales, the retail metric that measures revenue at established locations, the truest indicator of organic health, had begun a quiet, persistent decline. Not a crash, not a collapse, just a slow, steady bleed that nobody at the top of the organization seemed willing to confront directly. Because confronting it would have required admitting something uncomfortable. That linens and things, for all its size and revenue and real estate footprint, was losing the most important battle in retail. The battle for the customer's preference. Not their traffic, not their transaction. Their preference and the instinctive, unconsidered choice a person makes when they need a new set of sheets and they don't think twice about where to buy them. That preference was drifting, slowly, quietly. And in 2006, the wrong person walked through the door. By 2004, the warning signs were everywhere. Not in the headlines, not in the earnings calls where language was carefully managed and optimism was professionally maintained. The warning signs were in the small, unglamorous details that only became visible if you were paying close attention. Shelves that were sometimes understocked. A product assortment that felt slightly behind. Not wrong, just not quite right. A store layout that hadn't meaningfully evolved in a decade, while the competition had quietly, methodically refined every square foot of their floor plan. Bed Bath & Beyond wasn't just winning on price or selection. It was winning on feel. Walk into a Bed Bath & Beyond in 2004, and you felt organized. The merchandise was dense but navigable. The brand mix leaned into names customers recognized and trusted: KitchenAid, Dyson, Cuisinart, displayed with enough breathing room that shopping felt deliberate rather than overwhelming. The coupon strategy, that famous 20% off mailer that became a cultural artifact in its own right, gave customers a sense of control. You weren't being sold to, you were choosing when and how to save. Walk into a linens and things in the same year, and you felt something slightly different, familiar, comfortable, but increasingly like a store that was trying to compete on promotions rather than conviction. The clearance signs multiplied. The weekend events grew louder. The product quality in certain categories quietly softened as buyers chased margin. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that would make a customer walk out and never return. Just a slow, cumulative sense that the place wasn't quite what it used to be. Customers noticed. They didn't announce it. They didn't write letters. They just started making slightly different choices on Saturday mornings. The comparable store sales numbers told the story in cold arithmetic. Year over year, the revenue generated by established linens and things locations was declining. Not collapsing, declining. A percentage point here, a percentage point there. The kind of numbers that get buried in footnotes during earnings presentations and explained away with references to macroeconomic headwinds or category softness. But the trajectory was clear to anyone who looked honestly at the data. Linens and Things was losing its core customers one quiet Saturday at a time. Management responded with the tools they had: more promotions, more circulars, more clearance events designed to move inventory and generate traffic numbers that could be reported with confidence. The strategy kept the stores busy. It did not address the underlying problem. Meanwhile, the external environment was beginning to shift in ways that would matter enormously. The mid-2000s housing market was the last great tailwind linens and things would ever catch. New home sales were at historic highs. Every closing was a new household to outfit. New towels, new bedding, new cookware, new everything. The category was buoyed by a real estate boom that felt at the time like it might simply continue forever. Retail analysts pointed to the demographic pipeline, millions of millennials approaching household formation age, and projected years of sustained demand for exactly the products that filled Linens and Things shelves. What those projections didn't account for was what happens when the boom ends. The first tremors appeared in 2006. Home sales began softening in key markets. Prices that had climbed for years plateaued, then dipped. The word correction started appearing in financial coverage with a cautious frequency that precedes something much larger. For a retailer whose entire customer acquisition model was built around the life event of moving into a new home, this was not background noise. This was a structural threat to the business itself. But in 2006, Linens and Things had a more immediate problem. The CEO situation had been unstable for years. A rotation of leadership that reflected an organization struggling to agree on its own identity. Was it a value retailer? A promotional destination? A premium home goods experience? Each new executive brought a different answer, and the lack of strategic consistency had seeped into every level of the organization. Store managers operated with unclear direction. Buyers made conflicting decisions about product mix. Marketing swung between positioning strategies without ever landing on one with enough conviction to actually move the needle. The corporate culture, once defined by Calkin's clear and simple philosophy of everyday value, had become something murkier. A large organization searching for its footing, generating enough revenue to avoid confronting the fact that it had lost its way. And then, in February 2006, Apollo Global Management made its offer. $1.3 billion for the entire company. A leveraged buyout that would take Linens and Things private, away from the quarterly scrutiny of public markets, and hand it to a private equity firm whose expertise was financial engineering rather than retail operations. The board accepted. At the time, some analysts expressed measured optimism. Private equity ownership could bring discipline, they argued. Freedom from quarterly earnings pressure could allow management to make longer-term decisions. The LBO structure, while debt-heavy, was manageable if the business performed to historical levels. What those analysts were not fully accounting for was the specific nature of the bet Apollo was making. A leveraged buyout works on a simple and brutal logic. You borrow most of the purchase price, use the acquired company's own assets as collateral, and load the resulting debt onto the company's balance sheet. The company then has to generate enough cash flow, not just to operate, not just to invest in the business, but to service that debt before a single dollar reaches anything else. The model works beautifully when the underlying business is healthy, growing, and operating in a stable environment. It works catastrophically when any one of those conditions fails. In February 2006, Linens and Things was a business with declining comparable store sales, intensifying competition, a leadership identity crisis, and a customer base built on the back of a housing market that was quietly beginning to crack. Apollo loaded it with $650 million in debt anyway. The stores stayed open, the employees showed up, the weekend shoppers still pushed their carts through the familiar aisles. From the outside, nothing had changed, but the mathematics of what had just happened were unforgiving. Every single day that Linens and Things operated from February 2006 forward, it was running with a weight strapped to its back that it had never carried before. A weight that grew heavier with every interest payment, every missed sales target, every quarter where comparable store sales slipped another fraction of a point below the projection. The empire was still standing, but someone had just quietly removed the foundation beneath it. To understand what Apollo Global Management did to Linens and Things, you first have to understand what a leveraged buyout actually is. It sounds complex. The mechanics are deliberately obscured by financial jargon designed to make the process seem more sophisticated than it is. But strip away the language and the logic is almost shockingly simple. You find a company, a real company, one with stores, employees, inventory, real estate leases, customer relationships built over decades, a company that generates cash. Then you borrow an enormous amount of money using that company's own assets as collateral for the loan. You use the borrowed money to buy the company. And then, this is the part that matters, you transfer the debt onto the company itself. The company you just bought now owes the money that was borrowed to buy it. The private equity firm puts in a relatively small amount of its own capital. The company carries the rest. From that moment forward, the company isn't just running a retail business. It's running a retail business while simultaneously servicing a mountain of debt that it didn't choose, didn't create, and cannot escape. Every dollar of operating cash flow gets filtered through debt payments first. Investment in the business, new systems, better training, improved merchandising, the kinds of things that actually make a retailer competitive become secondary to keeping the lenders satisfied. This is what Apollo did to Linens and Things in February 2006. The purchase price was $1.3 billion. Apollo contributed a fraction of that from its own fund. The rest was borrowed. When the transaction closed, Linens and Things found itself carrying approximately $650 million in long-term debt, a number that represented not a strategic investment in the company's future, but the financing cost of its own acquisition. To put that in context, in the quarter ending September 2007, Linens and Things reported net sales of $666.8 million. The company was generating just enough revenue in an entire quarter to theoretically cover its total debt load. Before paying rent on 521 store locations, before paying 7,300 employees, before buying a single unit of inventory, before keeping a single light on. The margin for error was essentially zero. Apollo moved quickly to install its vision for the business. The strategy, as implemented through new management directives, centered on one priority above all others: generate cash, not build the brand, not invest in the customer experience, not close the competitive gap with Bed Bath & Beyond. Generate cash, service the debt, and position the company for an eventual resale at a profit. To generate cash in the short term, the new ownership leaned hard into the promotional playbook that had already been weakening the brand for years. Clearance events became more frequent and more aggressive. Discount signage multiplied across store floors. The merchandise mix shifted toward higher margin items that looked acceptable on a shelf, but didn't carry the quality reputation that had once anchored the brand's value proposition. Long-tenured merchants, buyers who had spent years cultivating supplier relationships and understanding what Linens and Things customers actually wanted, began to leave. Some were pushed out in restructuring exercises designed to cut overhead. Others read the strategic direction clearly enough to understand that the company they had built careers around no longer existed in any meaningful sense. They left for competitors, for other retailers, for anything that felt like it was building rather than extracting. Their institutional knowledge walked out with them. Store managers who had operated with relative autonomy under the previous ownership structure found themselves navigating a new corporate culture defined by financial metrics rather than retail instincts. The question was no longer, what does our customer need? The question was, what does the P&L need this quarter? Those are not always different questions. Under Apollo's ownership of Linens and Things, they almost always were. The paradox of the situation was almost architectural in its cruelty. Apollo had paid $1.3 billion for Linens and Things precisely because it was a large, established, cash-generating retail operation. The value was in the stores, the customer relationships, the brand recognition built over nearly 5 decades. But the strategy imposed after the acquisition systematically degraded each of those assets in the pursuit of short-term cash generation. The thing that made the company worth buying was being consumed to service the cost of buying it. Meanwhile, the competitive landscape continued shifting in ways that demanded investment, not extraction. Bed Bath & Beyond was accelerating. Its store count was climbing. Its private label program was expanding. It was beginning to develop the digital infrastructure that would eventually, too late as it turned out, but that's another story, allow it to compete in an e-commerce environment. The company was moving. It was spending. It was betting on its own future. Linens and Things under $650 million in debt could not afford to make the same bets. The e-commerce question is worth pausing on because it illuminates something important about the timing of the Apollo acquisition. In 2006, online retail was not yet the existential threat to brick and mortar that it would become. Amazon was a significant player, but it had not yet transformed consumer behavior at the scale that would ultimately reshape the entire retail industry. A well-capitalized Linens and Things in 2006 had a genuine window, not a large one, but a real one, to build the digital capabilities that could have extended its relevance into the next decade. That window required investment. It required the kind of patient capital deployment that prioritizes long-term positioning over short-term debt service. Apollo's structure made that investment functionally impossible. By 2007, the numbers that management had been carefully managing in earnings presentations were becoming impossible to obscure. Comparable store sales were declining with accelerating momentum. The operating loss for the quarter ending September 2007 reached $56.6 million, nearly 3 times the loss recorded in the same period the previous year. After interest expenses on the $650 million debt load, the pre-tax loss for that quarter alone was $79.2 million. The company was bleeding from every direction simultaneously: declining traffic, deteriorating brand perception, a product mix that had been compromised in pursuit of margin, a workforce demoralized by instability and uncertain direction, and above all of it, every single day, the relentless arithmetic of debt service that consumed cash the business could not afford to lose. Apollo's partners met, restructuring consultants were engaged, options were evaluated with the cold efficiency of people who manage distressed assets for a living. The stores were still open, the employees were still showing up, the Saturday shoppers were still pushing carts through aisles that looked superficially like they always had. But in the offices and conference rooms where the actual decisions were being made, everyone who was paying attention understood the same thing. This company was not going to make it. The only remaining question was how long it would take, and who would be left holding the bill when it ended. There is a particular kind of corporate collapse that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a single dramatic moment. No scandal, no fraud, no product failure that makes the front page. It arrives the way a structural failure arrives in an old building, quietly and visibly, in the spaces between the walls, until one day the weight becomes too much and everything comes down at once. For Linens and Things, that day was coming, and 2007 was the year the walls started visibly shaking. The housing market had been the last great protection. As long as Americans were buying homes, moving into new spaces, setting up new households, there would always be a fresh wave of customers walking through those glass doors for the first time. The new homeowner didn't know about the brand's declining quality, didn't know about the debt load, didn't carry the accumulated disappointments of a longtime customer who had watched the store slowly become something less than it used to be. The new homeowner just needed towels, and Linens and Things was right there in the strip mall. But in 2007, the housing market didn't just soften, it collapsed. Home sales fell off a cliff. Foreclosures began appearing in subdivisions that had been freshly built 18 months earlier. The financial instruments constructed around American mortgage debt, instruments so complex that the people selling them barely understood them, began failing in sequence, like lights going out down a long corridor. The word recession, which economists had been carefully avoiding, started appearing in mainstream news coverage with the resigned frequency of something that was no longer a possibility, but a fact. For Linens and Things, the housing collapse didn't just reduce customer traffic, it eliminated an entire category of customer. The new homeowner, that reliable, recurring source of first-time purchases, essentially stopped existing. And the longtime customer, the one who had been quietly drifting toward Bed Bath & Beyond for years, now had less discretionary income and even less reason to choose the option she trusted less. The numbers moved from concerning to alarming. Comparable store sales, already declining, dropped with new urgency. The operating loss for fiscal 2007 reached levels that restructuring consultants described in private meetings with the particular euphemism of unsustainable trajectory. The debt service, $650 million worth of obligations that demanded payment regardless of how many towels were sold, consumed cash that the business could no longer regenerate fast enough to replace. Management tried everything the playbook allowed. Store closure decisions were made, then reversed, then made again. In one particularly chaotic stretch, Linens and Things announced it would close 87 underperforming locations, then reduced that number to 57 as early liquidation results came in slightly above projections, then added 28 stores back onto the closure list 2 weeks later. The indecision was not incompetence. It was the behavior of an organization trying to navigate an impossible situation with instruments that no longer gave reliable readings. New leadership was brought in. Robert DeNicola, the CEO, found himself operating inside a structure where the fundamental decisions, how much debt to carry, how much cash was available for operations, whether the company could access additional credit, were no longer within the company's control. The lenders controlled those decisions, and the lenders, watching the same numbers that everyone else was watching, were becoming increasingly reluctant to extend the flexibility that a genuine turnaround would require. The credit markets, already tightening across the entire economy as the financial crisis spread, essentially closed to linens and things entirely. The company's debt load, its declining performance metrics, its deteriorating brand position, none of it made a compelling case to lenders who were suddenly acutely aware of risk in a way they hadn't been 18 months earlier. Without access to additional credit, the options narrowed to a single corridor. On the morning of May 2, 2008, Linens and Things and its affiliated entities filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the District of Delaware. The filing landed with the particular weight of something that had been inevitable for months, but still felt, when it finally arrived, like a physical shock. Chapter 11 is not a liquidation, not immediately. It's a legal framework designed to give a company breathing room to restructure its obligations, renegotiate its debts, and theoretically emerge as a leaner, more viable operation. The filing was accompanied by an announcement that 120 underperforming stores would close immediately, representing nearly a quarter of the entire chain. For the employees at those 120 locations, the news arrived the way bad news arrives in large organizations: unevenly, impersonally, and too fast for dignity. Some store managers received formal notification through official channels. Others learned from district managers who delivered the information in hurried phone calls between other conversations. Some employees arrived for their shifts and found notices posted on the doors before anyone had spoken to them directly. The stores that were staying open felt the tremor regardless. The uncertainty of not knowing if today's location would be on the next closure list was its own particular kind of damage to morale and performance. 400,000 customers discovered, with varying degrees of shock, that the gift cards in their wallets, representing approximately $42 million in combined value, were now frozen. Under bankruptcy law, gift card obligations become unsecured claims against the estate, ranking well below the interests of secured lenders. The customers who had given those cards as birthday presents, as housewarming gifts, as thoughtful gestures to people they cared about, they were now unsecured creditors in a Delaware bankruptcy proceeding. The cards were, for practical purposes, worthless. The bankruptcy filing triggered a brief, almost surreal period of institutional optimism. In August 2008, a reorganization plan was submitted to the bankruptcy court. The plan outlined a path to emergence, a restructured Linens and Things that would shed its debt, close its weakest locations, and return to the everyday low-price philosophy that had made the company worth something in the first place. There was genuine effort behind the plan. People inside the organization believed, or wanted to believe, that the brand still had enough equity with enough customers to justify the attempt. But the attempt required financing, and financing required lenders who believed the same thing. The Great Recession, which had officially begun in December 2007, was by the summer of 2008 consuming the financial system with a ferocity that made lending decisions across every sector simultaneously more conservative and more brutal. Banks were not in the business of betting on distressed, big-box retailers in a collapsing consumer environment. The reorganization plan, however earnestly constructed, could not find the capital it needed to become real. On October 7, 2008, Linens and Things filed a motion asking the bankruptcy court for permission to auction its remaining 371 store locations and conduct going-out-of-business sales. The reorganization was over. The auction was brief. On October 14th, the company announced the sale of its remaining assets to a consortium of liquidation specialists. Firms whose entire business model was built around extracting maximum value from the controlled dissolution of retail operations. This was not a rescue. It was an orderly dismantling. The buyers were not interested in the brand, the customer relationships, the 50 years of goodwill that Eugene Calkin had built one honest transaction at a time. They were interested in the inventory, the fixtures, and the lease termination processes. 7 days later, on October 17th, 2008, the signs went up. Going out of business. In 371 stores across 47 states, in strip malls and power centers from Maine to California, the same red and white signage appeared in windows that had previously displayed seasonal home decor and weekend sale announcements. The visual was unmistakable. The meaning was absolute. Linens and Things was not restructuring. It was not pivoting. It was not emerging from bankruptcy as a leaner version of itself. It was ending. There is a specific quality to the light inside a retail store that is being liquidated. It's the same fluorescent light that was always there. The same fixtures, the same wattage, the same cold white glow that made the towels look bright and the cookware look clean for 50 years. But something about the context changes it. When the shelves are full and the registers are humming and a Saturday morning crowd is working its way through the aisles, that light feels functional, purposeful. It's the light of commerce, of ordinary life moving forward. When the shelves are half empty and the going out of business signs are taped to every window, that same light feels like something else entirely. It feels like an autopsy. The liquidation sales began on October 17, 2008, in all remaining Linens and Things locations simultaneously. The mechanics were handled by the consortium of asset recovery firms that had purchased the chain's remaining inventory and store assets at auction 3 days earlier. These were professionals. They had done this before with other retailers, other brands, other stores full of other merchandise that had once meant something to someone. They moved efficiently and without sentiment, which was exactly what the situation required and exactly what made it so difficult to watch. The early days of the sales drew crowds. This is always the case with going out of business events, and it reflects something complicated about human behavior. People who hadn't set foot in a Linens and Things in 2 years suddenly found themselves in the aisles, carts loaded, hunting for discounts on merchandise they didn't urgently need. The liquidation mathematics were straightforward. Initial discounts of 10 to 20%, deepening week by week as the clock ran down and the inventory had to move. By late November, the remaining merchandise was moving at 50, 60, 70% off original retail. The crowds came for the deals. Many of them stayed in a way for something harder to name. A last look. A goodbye that they hadn't known they needed to say until they were standing in the middle of it. Consider the store manager. Call him David. The name is representative. The experience was real for hundreds of people just like him. 15 years at the same location. He had been there when the store opened in the mid-1990s, had worked his way up from the stockroom to the sales floor, to the assistant manager's desk, to the office in the back corner with the window that looked out over the parking lot. He knew the lease terms on every piece of equipment in the building. He knew which suppliers called on Tuesdays and which regional managers preferred to be emailed rather than called. He knew the names of the customers who came in every month without fail. The woman who bought new dish towels every spring like clockwork. The retired couple who spent an hour every Saturday examining the cookware section without ever buying anything. The young mother who had registered for her wedding here and now came back with a toddler in the cart. When the bankruptcy filing came in May, David had told his team what he believed, that the Chapter 11 process was real, that the reorganization plan was real, that the company was going to find a way through. He had believed it when he said it. He had needed to believe it. By October, there was nothing left to believe except the signs in the windows. He ran the going out of business sale the same way he had run every other sale in 15 years, with attention to detail, with care for the customer experience, with the professionalism that had defined his entire career at this company. He made sure the discounts were correctly signed. He made sure the remaining staff, a skeleton crew now, many of his best people already gone to other jobs, were treated with dignity during the weeks they had left. On December 28, 2008, David worked his final shift. He stayed until close. He walked the floor one last time after the last customer left. The way a person walks through a house they are about to leave forever, slowly, not quite ready, cataloging details that didn't need cataloging, except that the act of noticing them felt like the least he could do. The empty shelving units, the scuff marks on the linoleum from 15 years of cart traffic, the slight echo that only appeared when the store was completely empty, a sound he had never heard before because the store had never been completely empty before. He turned off the lights in sections, the way the closing procedure specified. Then he locked the door. Consider the customer. Call her Margaret. Retired school teacher, 63 years old, had been shopping at this Linens and Things since it opened. She had bought her daughter's first set of college dorm bedding here, had registered for her own anniversary gift replacement cookware here, had spent more Saturday mornings in these aisles than she could accurately count, moving at the unhurried pace of someone who was not just shopping, but doing something that felt, in a modest and unassuming way, like taking care of her family. Margaret came in during the final week of the liquidation, not for the discounts, though she did pick up a set of bath towels at 70% off. She came because the store closing had appeared in the local newspaper, and the fact of it had bothered her in a way she couldn't quite articulate to her husband when he asked why she seemed quiet at dinner. What she found when she arrived was a store that looked like it had been through something. The shelves that had once been stacked with careful abundance were stripped to their lowest levels, holding the last unsold items. The colors nobody wanted, the sizes that hadn't moved, the products that had sat through the entire liquidation period without finding a buyer. The layout that had once oriented her so naturally through the space felt disorienting now, stripped of the visual landmarks she had navigated by for years. She bought the towels. She stood in the checkout line behind 3 other customers. When it was her turn, the young woman at the register, early 20s, name tag slightly askew, the look of someone running on not enough sleep and too much uncertainty, scanned the towels and announced the total. Margaret paid. She picked up her bag. Then she said, to no one in particular, and to the register and to the whole empty store, "I'm going to miss this place." The young woman at the register nodded. She had heard some version of that sentence many times over the past 10 weeks. Consider the young employee. Her name was Ashley, 22 years old. This had been her first real job. Hired 2 years before the bankruptcy, trained on the register, moved to the customer service desk, beginning to understand the rhythms of retail management well enough that her store manager had mentioned once that she might be worth developing into a supervisory role. The bankruptcy filing in May had frightened her. The store closure announcement in October had been worse. She had sent out applications during the liquidation weeks. Other retailers, other positions, anything that offered stability, and had received enough responses to know that she would land somewhere. But somewhere wasn't here. And here, for all its problems, for all the signs that had been visible even to a 22-year-old that the company was struggling, had been the place where she had learned what she was capable of. She had learned that she was good with difficult customers, that she could stay calm during a holiday rush when everything was going wrong simultaneously, that she genuinely liked the work of helping someone find what they needed, of knowing the inventory well enough to say with confidence, "We have that in the back. Let me get it for you." She carried those things with her when she walked out for the last time. She also carried something less definable, a knowledge acquired at 22 in the circumstances she hadn't chosen, of what it looks like when an institution fails. Not from the outside, where it looks like headlines and stock prices and legal filings. From the inside, where it looks like good people doing their jobs carefully and professionally until the last possible moment. Because that is what people like that do, regardless of what the people at the top of the organization have decided. December 28, 2008, 9 p.m. The last Linens and Things store completed its final transaction, cleared its final customer, and closed its doors. The going out of business sales on the company website continued until February 15, 2009, a digital epilogue to a physical story that had already ended. Then that too went quiet. 571 stores, 47 states, 6 Canadian provinces, 300 employees at the peak, $2.8 billion in annual revenue, gone. Not gradually, not gracefully, not in the way that institutions are supposed to end, with time and acknowledgement and the opportunity to say a proper goodbye. In 8 weeks of liquidation sales and fluorescent lit farewells, the entire physical presence of linens and things in American life was erased. What remained was the debt, still being processed through the bankruptcy court, the lenders, still working through recovery calculations, the private equity partners, already moving on to the next acquisition, the next leverage structure, the next company whose assets could be borrowed against and whose cash flows could be redirected. And the people, David, who would spend months finding his footing in a retail landscape that had just watched one of its institutions collapse. Margaret, who would drive past the empty building for years before something else moved in. Ashley, who would carry what she had learned into the next chapter of her career and the one after that. The light was off. The door was locked. The empire was over. When a retail chain dies, the obituary is written in real estate. 571 store locations don't simply disappear when the lights go out. They persist. Enormous, empty, unmistakable. The big box footprint that had made linens and things so formidable in its prime now became its most visible monument to failure. Cavernous spaces, 30,000 to 40,000 square feet each, sitting dark and vacant in strip malls and power centers across 47 states. The going out of business signs came down. Nothing went up to replace them. Landlords who had signed long-term leases with one of America's largest home goods retailers suddenly found themselves holding agreements with a bankrupt estate. Lease negotiations moved through the bankruptcy court with the grinding slowness of legal processes that prioritized procedure over urgency. Some locations sat empty for a year, others for 2. In certain suburban markets, the vacant linens and things became a fixed feature of the landscape, a large blank presence that the community drove past every day without quite processing, the way you stop seeing something that has always been wrong. Retail analysts would later identify this period, late 2000 and into 2009 and beyond, as an early marker of what became known as the retail apocalypse, the phenomenon of large vacant anchor spaces hollowing out American strip malls and power centers. Linens and things didn't cause that phenomenon, but its 571 empty locations were among the most visible early evidence that something structural had changed in American retail, that the big box model that had seemed permanent was more fragile than anyone had admitted. The human cost was less visible, but more immediate. 7,300 employees at the peak. The actual number working at the time of final closure was higher when part-time and seasonal staff were counted. Estimates placed the total workforce impact closer to 17,000 jobs when all categories were included. These were not abstract figures. They were department managers and stockroom workers and customer service representatives and regional directors who had built careers around a company that no longer existed. They entered the job market in December 2008, the worst possible moment. The Great Recession was at its most acute phase. Unemployment was climbing toward 10% nationally. Retailers across the sector were contracting, not hiring. Circuit City, which had filed for bankruptcy the same month as Linens and Things, was in the process of liquidating 567 of its own stores. Mervyn's had just closed. Stephen Barry's was gone. The job market that Linens and Things employees walked into was crowded with other retail workers from other collapsed chains, all competing for positions that were becoming scarcer by the week. 400,000 customers held gift cards that were now worthless. $42 million frozen in a bankruptcy estate, distributed as pennies on the dollar to unsecured creditors after the secured lenders, the banks that had financed the LBO, collected their claims first. The customer who had received a Linens and Things gift card at Christmas 2007, tucked it in a drawer, and planned to use it for spring shopping never got that spring shopping trip. The couple who had loaded a gift card for their daughter's college move-in, the friend who had given one as a housewarming present, all of them absorbed a small personal financial loss that the bankruptcy court processed as a line item and that they experienced as a particular kind of betrayal. The suppliers absorbed losses of a different scale. Hundreds of vendors, textile manufacturers, kitchenware companies, small domestic producers who had built significant portions of their revenue around Linens and Things purchase orders. filed unsecured claims in the bankruptcy proceeding. The recovery rates on those claims were, in most cases, negligible. Some smaller suppliers did not survive the loss. Others survived but spent years rebuilding the revenue that a single large retail relationship had represented. And Apollo Global Management, the private equity firm that had engineered the $1.3 billion leveraged buyout, loaded the company with $650 million in debt, and overseen the strategic decisions that accelerated the collapse. Apollo reported a loss on the Linens in Things investment. The fund that had owned the chain took a write-down. On paper, the transaction was characterized as a failure. What that characterization obscured was the structural reality of how private equity compensation works. Apollo's partners had collected management fees throughout the period of ownership, fees paid by the company itself, drawn from the same cash flows that were simultaneously failing to service the debt. The fund's investors absorbed the principal loss. The partners collected their fees regardless. Nobody went to jail. Nobody was sued into meaningful accountability. The legal structures that governed the transaction had been followed correctly. The leverage had been applied within the boundaries of what the financial system permitted and in 2006 actively encouraged. The system had worked exactly as designed. That was perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire story. Not that something had gone wrong, but that something had gone exactly right. For everyone except the employees, the customers, the suppliers, and the communities that had counted on those 571 stores to still be there on Monday morning. The ashes were cold, and somewhere in Midtown Manhattan, the next deal was already being structured. In February 2009, the name Linens and Things was sold at auction. Not the stores, not the inventory, not the relationships with suppliers or the institutional knowledge of thousands of retail professionals who had spent careers building something real. Just the name, the brand, the intellectual property, the domain name lnt.com, the bridal registry database, the consumer brands that had lived on those shelves. The sale price was $1 million. 18 months earlier, Apollo Global Management had paid $1.3 billion for the entire company. The arithmetic of that comparison requires no commentary. It speaks with the flat, unambiguous clarity of a final balance sheet. The buyers, two liquidation firms, Hilco Consumer Capital and Gordon Brothers Brands, relaunched Linens and Things as an online-only retailer. The website went live. The familiar name appeared on a screen instead of above a door. It was a ghost of the original. The brand identity preserved in digital amber, while everything that had made the brand worth something was gone. The company changed hands again in 2013. And again. In July 2020, a holding company called Retail E-commerce Ventures acquired the rights and relaunched the website for a second time. In March 2023, that same parent company announced it was considering its own bankruptcy filing. The name that Eugene Kalkin had built over 50 years had become, in the 15 years since the physical stores closed, a brand passed between holding companies like an asset that everyone believed someone else could monetize. And nobody quite could. Because the thing that had made Linens and Things valuable was never the name. It was the trust, the Saturday morning ritual, the manager who knew where the Le Creuset was stocked, and the customer service desk that handled returns without argument. Those things couldn't be purchased at auction for $1 million. They couldn't be relaunched on a website. They had existed in physical space, in human relationships, in the accumulated experience of millions of ordinary transactions conducted with consistency and care over 5 decades. They were gone. The first lesson from Linens and Things is the one that sounds the most like a finance lecture and cuts the deepest when you look at what actually happened. Debt is not neutral. When a private equity firm loads $650 million onto a retail company's balance sheet, the debt does not sit passively in the background while the business operates normally. It actively reshapes every decision the company makes. It compresses the time horizon from years to quarters. It converts investment questions into survival questions. It transforms a business that was built on the long-term cultivation of customer trust into a machine for generating short-term cash. Because short-term cash is the only thing that keeps the lenders from calling. The $650 million didn't kill Linens and Things by itself, but it removed the company's ability to absorb any shock, respond to any competitive pressure, or invest in any future. When the housing market collapsed and the recession arrived simultaneously, a debt-free linens and things might have survived. It would have been painful. It would have required difficult decisions about store counts and cost structures, but the underlying business, the brand recognition, the customer relationships, the physical retail infrastructure, had genuine value that a financially flexible company could have protected and rebuilt around. The debt made flexibility impossible, and so the shocks that a healthy company might have weathered became fatal. The second lesson is about the difference between building and extracting. Eugene Calkin's original philosophy, everyday low prices, honest value, merchandise worth buying, was not sophisticated. It wasn't the product of a McKinsey engagement or a Boston Consulting Group framework. It was the product of a man who understood that retail is, at its core, a relationship. A customer gives you their Saturday morning and their discretionary income. In return, you give them something worth having at a price worth paying. Do that consistently for long enough, and you build something that has genuine resilience, because it is rooted in real human behavior rather than financial engineering. Apollo's approach was the precise inversion of that philosophy. It saw linens and things not as a relationship to be maintained, but as an asset to be leveraged. The stores, the inventory, the brand, these were not things to invest in. They were things to borrow against. The difference between those two orientations is the difference between a company that survives difficulty and one that is destroyed by it. The third lesson is the one that lands closest to home for anyone who has ever worked for a large organization and felt the specific anxiety of watching decisions get made above them that they know are wrong. The people who stocked the shelves and ran the registers and managed the store floors of linens. And things were, by every account, doing their jobs well until the very last day. The institutional failure was not a failure of the people inside the institution. It was a failure of the structure imposed on them. A structure designed in a Manhattan conference room by people who would never work a closing shift, never explain to a customer why her gift card no longer worked, never turn off the lights in a store they had spent 15 years building. The gap between the people who make the decisions and the people who live with the consequences is not unique to linens and things. It is a recurring feature of leveraged buyouts across every industry, but it is worth naming clearly because the clarity matters. Eugene Calkin opened a small linen department in 1958 because he believed ordinary people deserved quality at a fair price. He built something that lasted nearly 50 years on the strength of that belief. In 2006, someone looked at what he had built and saw something different. Not a relationship, not a community, not 50 years of earned trust. A balance sheet. That is the distance between the first day and the last day, between the quaint leased linen counter in a New Jersey discount store and the red going out of business signs in 571 windows, between building something and taking it apart.